Thank you, Patrick. And just to begin with, I'd like us to give a huge applause to Patrick for doing a magical job as an MC today. With regards to attending a magic show in Vienna, it was kind of like a joke with Patrick because he is now going to be head of a magical association there, so you could ask Patrick about more about this later. But yeah, it's just so it's not a lifelong dream about the Vienna thing, it was more a joke with Patrick. So hi, my name is Svana, as Patrick said, and I'm here to talk about biohacking with wearables today. To begin with, I'd just like some quick interactivity, and thank you all for coming back. It was super nice outside, and I saw everybody had beer, so thank you for coming back in here. So let's just keep this lively if we can. Can you please raise your hand if you have a wearable of some sort? And when I mean a wearable, I mean like a smartwatch, or a chest strap, or just anything, even rings today? Okay, it's like maybe 30% of the room. Can you raise your hand if you have an Apple Watch? Just to get more specific. Okay, what about a Garmin? A few, yeah. And what about a Fitbit? Okay, thank you. Okay, for the Fitbitters in the room, which was actually a few, this graph might actually look familiar. So a few years ago, this was in January 2016, Kobe, who was an Israeli man, tweeted this picture here. And this is a graph from his Fitbit device. So Kobe got broken up with, and actually unbeknownst to him, his Fitbit captured the moment when it happened. So you're seeing a day in the life of Kobe. So you're seeing 12 hours. No, sorry, 24 hours. That's the length of a day. So you see in the beginning, I think he's sleeping, then he's just probably waking up and having his coffee, and his boyfriend calls him, and you can see where the red arrow is, which actually his boyfriend calls him and breaks up with him. And for the rest of the day, his day is kind of spiky. Like his heart rate goes up to like almost 118 beats per minute. So I think it's kind of remarkable to live in a day and age where we have technology that makes it possible to actually capture this just continuously without us having to be in a lab. We can just see things, like if events like this, and I hope it doesn't happen very often to you, and especially like he got broken up over the phones, which is not great either. But we can capture this without having to be in a lab. So I think this is like gives us quite the opportunity for self-improvement. And this is what I'm going to talk about today, like give you ideas of how we can actually do this. So I'm going to cover three things. Firstly, I'm going to cover physiological signals and their relation to emotions. Then secondly, I'm going to go over what wearables actually exist and what sensors they have. And then in the end, I'm going to give you ideas and tips for everyday experiments. And I'm kind of hoping that everybody comes kind of enlightened out of this and starts experimenting a lot with biosignals after this. Okay, to start with, I'm going to speak about physiological signals and their relation to emotions. So when I was writing my thesis a few years ago, I was actually looking at the definition of emotion. And I kind of come from an engineering background where I kind of expected there to be like a definition of emotion in 3 sentences telling me exactly what an emotion was. However, in social sciences, and especially psychology and physiology, and there's no such thing. So I went in there, and it was kind of shocking that scientists do not agree on a definition of emotion. There's like books after books after books about disagreements and arguments about what an emotion actually is. So I'm not going to bore you with this because I found it really boring to read about it. However, there is one thing that I took out of it, which is, and actually what I base this talk on here today, that changes in physiological signals, as happened to Kobe, are actually related to emotions. So just to demonstrate that briefly, let's take a closer look at Kobe's breakup. So what happens in the beginning is that there's some sort of stimulus, and that can be anything, but in this case, like Kobe got broken up with over the phone. What happens after that is that he experienced an emotion. So maybe you can think about what actually Kobe experienced after that. What would you experience if you got broken up with? Yeah, sadness, anger. Yeah, some of my colleagues said, well, he's not going to be paying half of the rent anymore. So there could be all sorts of stuff you experience. There could be maybe his boyfriend is not going to cook for him anymore. Like in any case, we know he experiences an emotion. And as a result of that, the body actually responds to this, what happened, this life event, with changing your bodily functions. And this is the key to everything. We can use wearables to measure this. So, is it the heart rate that only changes when emotions are? No, there's a huge amount of signals that we can actually measure. And here is a diagram of a system that actually takes care of everything in our body when there are emotions. And it's called the autonomic nervous system. And before I actually go over this diagram, because I find it kind of frightening when I looked at it first, I want you to think about the last time you felt scared. And especially there are some speakers in the room. How did you feel right before you went on stage or while you were on stage? Did you notice anything, any changes that were happening in your body? So for myself, I can tell you like my heart rate is much higher than it usually is. I get a little bit sweaty in my palms. My hands are a bit shaky. I can kind of show you by like doing this. Your body is reacting to this kind of threat that you're standing in front of a whole auditorium. Everybody's looking at you. The only thing you want to do is just flee. But you can't. But in old times, this is actually what was happening. Like, our brains are like this. So if you imagine you're a gazelle, and you can kind of, like, there's lions everywhere. So you kind of have a fight or flight response. You're going to flee because you don't want to get eaten. So this is kind of the same. Your body is kind of like prepping you up for doing something, but in this day and age, it's kind of not appropriate because everything has changed. There's new kinds of stresses. So the autonomic nervous system is kind of split into two branches. One is called the sympathetic. It's also called the fight or flight response. And the other one is parasympathetic. It's kind of rest and digest. It's kind of probably what most of the auditorium is doing now. You had cookies and you had beer, so you're kind of in like a restful state. I am, on the other hand, is probably my sympathetic nervous system is kind of acting up. It has like a whole wealth of signals that we can actually measure. Optimally, we'd want to measure all of them just to see like a range of things and trying to kind of map it to different emotions. However, there's all sorts of things in there that would be very uncomfortable to measure, such as like pupil dilation. You'd have to have a camera in your face all the time. Or digestion, I'd assume you would have to be in a lab for that. So the signals that I'm going to show you are the ones that are very easily measured from your wrists, or such as like the watch that I have today. So the three things that I'm going to like look into with you are cardiac activity, so your heart, how that works, then sweat production, and that's what I was mentioning now, like when you get stressed, sometimes you get a bit more moist in your hands, like in your palms. And then thirdly, what I'm going to look into is skin temperature. So let's start with the heart. So how do we actually measure the heart? Well, if you look at the back, and this is like the back of my Garmin watch, there are these 3 green lights, and it can be different amounts of green lights. But what they do is that they measure they put these green lights and flash them into your wrist, and they measure how much the green lights gets absorbed. Based off of that, and this is called the PPG sensor, and seeing it's really like that abbreviation translates to something that I can't really pronounce, but it just means like this is a way to measure heart activity. What we can extract from those measurements is a heart rate. So I found this graph, and I find it interesting because this is Jack, the CEO of Twitter, that actually posted this, and this is a graph of his heart rate right before he went into a Senate hearing. And I don't know if you remember this, but a few months back, there was a Senate hearing with Facebook and Twitter. And if I remember correctly, no representative from Google attended, but there was like this huge debacle going on with social media companies, and they have to go into a Senate hearing and get questioned. And you can see in the beginning of the graph, like he's obviously in very good shape. He has like a resting heart rate of 44. Then he goes in there and gets questions, and his heart rate just goes up through the roof. So this is actually something we can measure, and he obviously has an Apple Watch, and we get these graphs, so that's pretty cool. Another thing that we can measure is actually something called heart rate variability, and it's something that scientists are very excited about. So what you can see here are the intervals between beats, and actually a heart actually some variance in your heartbeat is actually very healthy. You want some variance because you know the fight and flight part of the nervous system and the rest and digest are kind of both kind of saying, hey, I need my time. So you want some variability, and I'll tell you about this later. But so that's another thing we can measure. And if you have low heart rate variability, we know you're under a lot of stress. Then thirdly, we can measure something called skin conductance. And what that means is just when we experience something that is very kind of emotionally arousing or something, you're stressed or you're excited, your skin becomes a better conductor of electricity. And this is something we can measure. And what I found very interesting is that MIT Media Lab has been doing like fascinating stuff with this. And they made this kind of, I don't know what to call this, but I assume this is a glove. So let's say this is a glove, this purple thing. And what they did is that during TED Talks, like a whole day of TED Talks, they asked all the attendees to wear this glove. And what it would do is it would light, like this light would be shining bright if the audience was engaged, so skin conductance was high, and it would not light up if skin conductance was low. So what they found out, and it's actually something that I tried to tweak my talk for, is that people got super excited when there was a new speaker coming on stage. They were very excited about live demos. If something went wrong, they were also very engaged. But however, when there were long PowerPoint slides with a lot of kind of text, and you could kind of see it going down very quickly. Also, marketers have used this response a lot for kind of tweaking movie trailers. So they've kind of taken a look at if you're making a movie trailer or an ad, when the audience becomes engaged. So if you think of Wolf of Wall Street, like the team is going to make a trailer for it, so they would measure the audience looking at it, like when do they become engaged? And of course it is when Leonardo DiCaprio appears. So it's been used for interesting stuff. And like furthermore, if you're interested in this, the MIT Media Lab has been doing really fascinating stuff with this, and especially with people with epilepsy. So they've been making wristbands for them to detect, like if we can make any sort of mechanism that would detect the audio, like a close one right before a seizure. That's what they've been using skin conductance for. And the same with people on the autism spectrum that have a hard time communicating. They've been using this response to kind of try to tweak how their therapies are conducted and more things. So there's a lot of interesting TED Talks from MIT Media Lab, and they've made, I think, at least 2 commercialized wearables from there. They're called Embrace and E4, if I remember correctly. Before I go into the wearable section, I just want to say briefly that cardiac activity and skin conductance are really good signals to figure out if an emotion you're having is intense. So your skin conductance and your heart rate would go up for something that is super exciting, but also really negative. So if you're really angry. So it's really hard to distinguish between a positive and a negative emotion. So just to give you that caveat, which is really good that if you're doing these self-experiments, you're going to have context on this yourself. You know if it was a good or a bad one. For someone else looking at this data, it's harder. Skin temperature, as I mentioned earlier, has proven, or some people say that it's an indicator if an emotion is good or bad, but if I read the research paper, it's actually very different in which direction it goes. So some people say skin temperature goes up when you have a positive emotion, and some people say it goes down. So I'm just putting a bit of a caveat here. Then I'm gonna tell you what wearables exist and what sensors they have. And there's actually this very interesting page called wandrecode.com that has just this huge archive of wearables. And you can hover over this human and see what wearables exist for what kind of body parts. And I was actually very baffled how many of them exist. And there's like wearables for the neck, and most of them for the wrist, not maybe surprisingly, but there's all sorts of things for the legs. There's all sorts of stuff available, but there's 431 devices out there in this archive, and I even don't think it's complete. And it's from 226 companies. So when I intended to do an overview of the wearables and the sensors, I was like, that's mission impossible. So I actually just took a look at the companies that have the most units shipped in 2017 and 2018, and that was Apple, Fitbit, Garmin, and a Chinese company, and took a look at what sensors they actually have. So for sensors, most of the companies have an accelerometer, a gyroscope, altimeter, GPS, and an optical heart rate sensor, which is just a heart rate sensor I just told you about with the green lights. Very excitingly, or kind of interestingly, Apple Watch that is already out there is allowing people in the US to try out a new sensor called ECG, so electrocardiogram, which is actually a better sensor of the heart. But it only allows it for people in the US. So if you actually create an Apple account in the US with your watch, I think you will be able to try it. I'm assuming it has something to do with health licenses without knowing the background of this. And then Garmin also has something called magnetometer. I think I'm saying this correctly. I do not know what they use it for, but it exists. Then some wearables have a skin temperature sensor and a skin conductance sensor, but it's more rare than not that they actually do. Okay, so I'm gonna go over ideas and tips for everyday experiments. And one thing I wanna say in the beginning is that when somebody tells me something like, you should really try this, I find this really helpful here, is that I say, like, so when I come home after a hard day, like my partner tells me, like, Svana, you should really try meditation. I think it would really help you. And then I'm like, okay, how has it helped you? And they're like, oh, I feel much better. And I was like, how have you validated this with data? Well, he could do it with this. So my idea number one is kind of change something and measure it. And I found this interesting graph. It's also a Fitbit graph from Reddit. And it's actually a person. You can see in the beginning, like his heart rate, resting heart rate is actually rising. And at the peak, his girlfriend breaks up with him and moves out. After that, everything is much calmer. So what I'm saying is, like, you could change something and measure it. I'm not telling you to break up with your significant other, but like you could change something and measure it. I was very not saying that. Then I was interested in this peak here, so I kind of went through the Reddit, and in the end found out that the author said that his girlfriend had unexpectedly come back here to get some stuff. So, but yeah, it was very interesting to me. I am currently, like the experiments I'm doing, just to give you some idea, is that I am from Iceland, and I have found it really difficult to live in London. Like, it's a much bigger city than I'm used to. Like, in Iceland, there's barely a public transportation system. But so what I've been doing in London is actually, I'm doing an experiment now to see if I find it less stressful to travel with bus to work than the underground, because the underground is really packed. So that's kind of like, you don't have to break up with someone to do these kind of things. You can just do something that is less drastic and see if it affects you. Idea number two, if you're about to do something big, you can measure it. So this person here, before he proposed to his wife, he put on a chest strap and measured his heart rate while proposing. So you can see in the beginning, they're in Rome, and this is a time scale of 40 minutes. They're walking in the Colosseum, then he buys ice cream, and they enjoy the ice cream, and then he goes kind of down. I think his digestion system kicks in. Then at some point, it was like, holy shit, I need to do this. That's here, and then he starts proposing using words here, and then everything is fine. She says yes. But if you're about to do something big, you can measure it. So as an alternative example, I'm measuring myself while I'm speaking here. And then I can I can plot it out afterwards to just see when I was stressed, etc. So you could use D3 to do that. So I measured myself while I was traveling to AgentConf yesterday, and I actually had quite a long of a journey. I flew to London, went to Zurich, met my brother, and then took a train to Dornbirn. And you can use, what I used is called Observable, was previously called D3 Express. And they have all sorts of nice things you can do to visualize things. This is a fairly slow animation. But the peak here, I think, I should have mapped this out, but I think it was when there was a lot of turbulence in my flight. So I got very nervous. I was on a very small plane. But what you could also do is, if you're doing something else, like you can do different kinds of graphs. So this is when I was running Berlin Half Marathon last year. And you can see there's a distance on the x-axis, and on the y-axis there's elevation. And then you can color the bars based on your heart rate. So I was kind of taking a look at heart rate zones. So green is when I'm kind of relatively low effort, everything is fine. The red one is really pushing it. And then you can animate it again, and this is a faster one. But you can do all sorts of things, and there are pre-made examples online as well, so you don't have to do everything from scratch. And I can also share the link to what I was using this with. So I also want to give you kind of tips based on my prior experiments if you want to go into this. So first of all, what I would do is change your Garmin settings. So what I have found is that if you just passively measure the heart rate without kind of saying I'm running, they will save it in a different format called .fit. It's really hard to work with. So what I do is that I actually tell the watch that I'm running, and it will save the data to a GPX file that is much easier to work with. You can also go into the settings and actually ask the watch to not do smart monitoring, but rather sample every second. So it will give you more data, so I actually recommend that. Another kind of tip with Garmin is that I actually asked them, or I sent a request, and I sent 2 of them to get access to an API where I could just get the data easily from. They rejected me twice and just told me I don't have a valid business reason. I don't think they're very excited about my emotion hacking. But you can also buy access to it for 5,000 euros, which I do not want to do. But so I've kind of just hacked the system and kind of adjusted it to my needs. Tip 2, there's actually loads of people doing this in the community, and I've actually found remarkable resources. So I found on the App Store recently a person that allowed you to get access very easily to the raw sensor data from the Microsoft band. This is actually a band. Microsoft Band 2 was actually discontinued 2 years ago, but it had all the sensors that I wanted. But this person just found a way to get all the data, which actually has proven remarkably hard with a lot of carriers to actually get the data out of their ecosystem. But if you Google for this, you'll find very detailed articles about how to do this. Community is fairly active in this. And number 3, if you want a sensor that is not commercially available, what I did in the past is I just ordered them from China. And here you can see what I built for my master thesis. I had issues finding sensors that were suitable. So I contacted my brother that is an electrical engineer, and he helped me build this kind of crude machine using Arduino and then just sensors we bought online. And then we built a Python graphical user interface that can graph up your heartbeat. This is skin temperature, and this is skin conductance. Yeah, so there's always a way. There might be some caveats. So it doesn't come in a nice watch. So this is how it looked. So I'm not saying it's perfect, but there's always a way. We can always work around it. Then tip number 4 is that context matters. So this here is actually the lab that I used when I was doing my master thesis. So what I did when I really wanted to measure this is that measure if people had some changes in physiological signals while experiencing emotions, is that I asked people to pick a happy song, and then they all came in and I measured them. What I wanted to do, the reason why I was in the lab, is because I wanted to eliminate all external factors that were having effects on like their physiological signals. I wanted to be able to isolate this. So the thing is, context really matters. So even though they were listening to their happy songs, I think it would have really annoyed them that I was both sitting here watching them while listening to the music, and then secondly, they were in this kind of sterile lab environment, and thirdly, they were hooked up to all this shit. So context really matters, and it's the same in just when we track our data. It's not going to mean anything to you if you see a spike in heart rate if you don't know what you were doing. So context really matters. And then number 5 is that super clear instructions are important if you're going to do experiments with external people. So I was living in Germany at the time when I was doing this research. And I was getting participants, and I put together kind of this pamphlet, like, please pick a happy song. And it just said, a song that makes you happy, energized, etc. Then a remarkable amount of people came into the research and had picked Happy by Pharrell. And then when they were listening to it, they looked particularly annoyed. So, I mean, so I don't know if they misread the instructions or the German translator just didn't do a good job. So maybe they just went on Spotify, typed in happy, it's like, this was my task, I will take this in. So I think super clear instructions are important if you're going to do research like this to external people. It might also be because I was watching them while listening, so it might have been annoying as well. So just to wrap this up, I find that we live in a remarkable kind of day and age, as I said earlier, where we can actually do this kind of research. And I think it's really important for us to understand more how the environment affects us. And I hope that I have maybe inspired some of you to take a look at this, because it is fairly promising, and the more people that look into this, the more we'll figure out. So thank you.
I wanted to ask, you talked about skin conductivity, and is it really like when an event happens that changes your skin conductivity, is it really like happening in seconds, or is it more of like minutes that need to be recorded to get some results?
So with skin conductance, so he's asking how quickly does the response show up? The skin conductance actually shows up really quickly. The same with heart rate. It's really like very easily influenceable. However, with skin temperature, one should really keep in mind that it's a slower moving signal, and some signals are actually slower. So if you'd be looking at skin temperature, that would be 15 to 20 seconds later. However, with skin conductance, it's almost immediate.
Hi. May I ask what you're actually doing after your research? Say you found out that your heart rate went up really high when I don't know, when the plane almost crashed. Like, are you, or you were speaking here or answering questions? Do you like sell those, those enlightenments, or will they be used medically, or do you know of research that has been done in a fashion for medicine, for example?
So there's a few things in this question that I want to address. So first of all, what do I do with my discoveries? I don't do much with it, but just tweak myself. I think everybody responds differently. Like biosignals work differently in everyone. So it's really hard to kind of generalize it to a population. So I think it's a very hard field, and I'm hoping more people get involved to kind of help figure it out. But no, I don't sell it at all. I just tweak my own behavior. And now I'm trying to remember the second part. I should have written it down. You asked two questions, kind of. Can you repeat it?
Do you know if there is?
Yeah, if there's any companies working on this. Yeah, so a few years ago when I started looking into this, it was mostly it was very experimental. However, what I've seen, what is happening a lot in the US, is that you can see a lot of companies are actually investing more in health and wearables. And there's actually very frightening kind of numbers that a health organization in the US came with, that in 2030, like the rate of depression will be really high. So it seems like the US at least has some research going on in even commercial companies, especially insurance companies that would not benefit greatly from like half the population becoming depressed. So it seems like this is kind of taking off, like using these kinds of signals to predict illness, and kind of trying to be quick to respond, because that's cheaper for the health industry rather than catching it really late when you're really sick. So it seems it's taking off, but I don't have any more concrete examples.
Excuse me. So what is your end goal for this? Do you want to be capable of controlling your own emotions?
Yeah, I'd love to.
What's the purpose of your research?
So I can tell you why I decided to come and speak today. It's like I don't really like public speaking, and I'm kind of trying to tweak how I feel, like what I do in the uprising and measuring my signals. So I am on a mission to kind of tweak myself using this, and I came to speak today kind of to do an experiment. My end goal is just tweaking myself, so I become maybe less nervous every day and I feel better. And I'll be able to instead of just saying, oh, you'll feel better after this, I'd be able to say, oh, this actually affected me well. Because I see a lot in the community of like, meditation will do this for you, but maybe that doesn't work for me. But maybe it does. But my end goal is just tweaking myself.
Here's another question. Hey, good talk. Do you think we live in a future where we could possibly detect some sort of a heart attack just by wearing an Apple Watch?
Totally. So both Garmin and Apple have some sort of mechanism you can actually turn on that would alert you to if your heart rate is abnormally high. So I can also tell you kind of a frightening story. So the other day, my mother had an allergic attack, and she was wearing her Garmin watch while doing it, and she did not have this turned on, but her heartbeat, and I actually looked at the graph, went really low. I wish that would have triggered something to let my dad know. But everything is fine. But I still wish that, like, it is there, but it needs to be changed a lot so you can actually assign a person that would be called. But yeah, I think we're even there yet, that this actually exists.
Yeah, thanks, Svana, for a talk. I just wanted to add on that one. Apple actually has it enabled by default, as far as I know, because it triggered once on me, and I was like, hey, what the fuck is going on? So it was a false alarm. But one thing I wanted to add, they also built in the new model, I think, this kind of accelerator. So when you crash on a bicycle, and I do crash on my bicycle sometimes, it might even call the ambulance and send a notification of you. So I think there's like lots of not just the heartbeat rate, but also like the fact you just crashed and probably lying half dead, and you might need help is kind of also detectable by having a thing on your wrist. Yeah.
So that's fantastic. So yes, we're already there. The more use cases we have, like, I mean, false alarm is better than no alarm. So I think it's fantastic.
One last question.
Hi, it's me again. But like now you've mentioned lots of companies that do track us, and I also like just recently discovered that my beloved Huawei phone tracks a lot of stuff in the fitness area about my day that actually I never really thought of. Like, but what if I don't want to share all this information with the companies, but I want a watch that like tells me when somebody wrote me, but I don't want Apple to know, you know, that I'm in a bad shape, or have Facebook, where is he? Facebook listening on me, or some Chinese company know exactly, you know, that kind of things. So did you ever try to do the opposite of your research and try to ban all this, or did it cross your mind even?
So this did definitely cross in mind because there are huge privacy concerns. I don't remember if, I don't know if you remember my slide, but I have like, there's always a way where I showed kind of an Arduino sensoring device with 3 sensors. If you don't want to have a commercially available a wearable watch that tracks all of this stuff, you could just build your own, and that's not sending data to anyone but you. It's always a way.
Thank you so much for your questions. Thank you, Svana, for this wonderful presentation. This conference has been gradually getting better for me. The quality of the lineup is usually really, really good, and this is something I'm really saying thumbs up.
They're really trying to get speakers here that are pushing to the future of web technologies.
I just feel like it's a very community-driven conference. It also has a lot of quality, and people are just nice. Hi, my name is Sarah, and this is AgentConf in Dornbirn.
Amazing venue. Austria is beautiful. Meeting all of the people in the community and getting to go and hang out and ski.